Ever get that nagging feeling when an explanation just doesn't quite add up? Like a piece of the puzzle is missing. Or maybe something just feels fundamentally off.
Definitely.
Today, we're diving headfirst into a situation exactly like that, where, the initial silence on a really crucial decision and then a later attempt to kind of fill that void, it raises some pretty serious red flags about fairness and, well, the very foundation of our legal processes.
We're going to be focusing on a specific ruling. A no jurisdiction ruling. It came from a special tribunal that operates under the Industrial Relations Act.
Okay.
And our source material for this deep dive, it's basically legal documents, analyses surrounding this specific event.
Right.
And what these sources seem to reveal is rather compelling and maybe even deeply concerning chain of events.
Now, you might be listening and thinking, Industrial Relations Act, special tribunal. Why should I care?
Fair question.
And that's a totally valid question.
Yeah.
But what we're really unpacking here are the core principles that should, underpin any fair system.
Like how decisions get made.
Exactly. How decisions are made, the vital role transparency plays, and what happens when those principles are, well, according to our sources, potentially just disregarded. We think we've got some genuine aha moments coming up, touching on these really essential ideas like duty, proper procedure.
Yeah, the nuts and bolts.
And the potentially severe consequences of what the sources allege is a kind of deception, right, within a legal framework. Our goal is to really get to the heart of this, even if you're not, say, a legal expert.
So our mission here in this deep dive is really to meticulously examine the intricacies of this situation.
Okay.
We want to pull out the most critical insights, but directly from the provided sources.
Stick to the document.
Stick to the documents. Understand the potential ramifications for everyone involved, based strictly on the information we have in front of us.
Okay, let's unpack this then. It all seems to kick off with this initial action by the special tribunal.
Right.
They delivered an oral ruling. Just spoken. Saying they had no jurisdiction over a particular dispute.
And the sources suggest this dispute might have involved officers from the State Police Association, the EPA.
Okay, EPA officers.
So right out of the gate, the tribunal basically said, nope, can't hear this case.
And according to these sources we're looking at, the moment that oral ruling, no jurisdiction, was actually spoken, a very specific legal responsibility was triggered for the EPA. The sources call it the duty to appeal.
Like a stopwatch starting.
Exactly, like a timer started the second the ruling was made.
Yeah, and the sources are quite forceful on this point.
They are. They actually label the failure to appeal as a dereliction of duty by the EPA. That's strong stuff.
It is strong language.
So why? Why was this failure to immediately challenge the ruling seen as such a critical error?
Well, what's fascinating here, or maybe crucial is the better word, is the specific role of this tribunal.
Right.
The sources really stress that the special tribunal is the only body, the exclusive one, authorized to resolve these types of disputes under the Industrial Relations Act and even constitutional law.
The only one.
Okay. So the argument follows that by not appealing right away, the EPA essentially, perhaps inadvertently, gave up the rights of the officers involved.
Wow.
And it created this sort of false sense that the matter was definitively closed, finished, even if that initial no jurisdiction ruling might have been, well, wrong.
So it gave a false finality.
Exactly. As one of our sources puts it directly. They should have appealed immediately because the special tribunal is the exclusive body for adjudicating such disputes under the Industrial Relations Act and constitutional law. It's quite clear.
Very clear. So, okay, that missed opportunity to appeal seems to be the first big red flag the sources are waving.
That's a major point of concern, yes.
But then we get to this other issue, the reason behind the ruling. Or maybe more accurately, the apparent initial lack of a reason.
Right. The tribunal said no jurisdiction, but didn't immediately explain why they reached that conclusion.
And this is where the situation, reading these sources, it feels like it becomes even more problematic.
It does. They explain that when a tribunal gives an oral ruling but doesn't provide the reasoning right then and there, there's a very specific and, importantly, lawful course of action that should be taken.
Okay, what is that?
That action is to immediately petition the high court. Ask for something called judicial review.
Okay, judicial review, that's basically asking a higher court to step in and check if the tribunal, followed the correct legal steps in making its decision. Is that about right?
That's a good way to put it, yeah. The aim is to compel the tribunal to issue a lawful decision, and crucially, to provide the legal justification for that decision. Make them show their work, essentially.
Got it. So the legal rulebook is clear. No reason given. Immediately go to the high court and ask for one. Makes sense.
Seems straightforward.
But what our sources really zero in on is what they claim didn't happen. And what they say is absolutely not allowed under any circumstances.
Exactly. The sources state very clearly that it is not lawful to invent or fabricate a reason after the fact.
Okay, not lawful. Full stop.
That's a fundamental point they're making. The proper legal way to get clarity on a ruling, it's to follow the established legal processes at the time of the ruling, not later.
Right. Not try to fix it afterwards.
Precisely.
And this leads us to what the sources describe as the really serious allegation here. Fraudulent collusion.
Yeah, that term definitely jumps out.
It sounds incredibly significant. What exactly are the sources alleging took place here?
So the sources lay out 3 specific conditions. Conditions under which they argue a post facto reason. Yeah, a reason given much later crosses the line into fraudulent collusion.
Okay, what are the 3?
First, the tribunal provides a reason, but only after realizing they didn't give one originally.
Okay, condition 1.
Second, that specific reason they give later was not actually stated during the hearing when the ruling was originally made. It wasn't announced then.
So it wasn't part of the original decision-making process, or at least not stated.
Correct. And third, and this is the kicker, the sources allege that this after-the-fact reason was fabricated.
Fabricate, meaning?
Made up. Essentially invented to try and justify the initial no jurisdiction ruling, specifically because, allegedly, no valid legal basis was provided at the time.
Wow. Okay. So if all 3 of those things happened, the sources aren't just talking about, like, a mistake or an administrative slip-up.
No, not at all.
They're suggesting a potentially deliberate act of deception. And they go further, right? They say this could constitute fraudulent collusion not just by the tribunal itself.
Right, not just them.
But also by any party. And they actually name names, or at least roles. The EPA, State Counsel, the Attorney General.
Yes, they mention those potential parties.
Any of them who then accepts or uses this allegedly fabricated reason in their own subsequent legal filings.
That's the core of the collusion allegation. And there's a key legal principle the sources bring into play here.
Which is?
It's the idea that fraud vitiates everything it touches.
Vitiates, meaning?
Spoils, corrupts, invalidates. They cite a case, Lazarus Estates, Ltd v. Beasley, to back this up.
Okay, fraud spoils everything it touches.
In essence, yes. What this powerful principle means is that if fraud is found to be present in any part of a legal process, it taints the entire thing. It corrupts the whole process, potentially rendering it completely invalid.
So let's connect the dots. If this reason, the one allegedly provided later, was indeed fabricated, as these sources contend,
yes,
then any judgment, any legal proceeding that relied on that fabricated reason is, according to this principle in the sources, legally void.
That's the argument. Void. It has to be set aside as a matter of law.
That is a massive claim. Yeah. Just huge potential implications.
It really is. And the sources don't stop there. They then dig into the question of, well, who bears the legal responsibility if such a thing happened, if a fabricated reason was used?
Right. Who's accountable?
Their argument, based on what they call established legal principles, black letter law, essentially, is that all parties who knowingly use or accept or even defend this fabricated reason are legally accountable. Potentially everyone involved who knew.
So not just the person who allegedly made it up, but anyone who went along with it knowingly.
That's the assertion. We could be looking at quite widespread consequences.
Let's try and break that down. Who specifically do the sources suggest could face legal exposure, and what might that look like for them?
Okay, so for the member or members of the tribunal who allegedly fabricated the reason, the sources point to things like potential administrative misconduct, maybe abuse of office, serious stuff for a judicial officer.
Definitely serious. What about the EPA side? The officers or their lawyers?
For the EPA officers or perhaps their legal representatives, if they used this reason in court filings knowing it was fabricated, the allegations mentioned include potential fraud on the court. And remember that earlier point, that initial failure to appeal.
The dereliction of duty.
Exactly. That comes back into play too.
Okay. And what about the state's legal representatives, the Solicitor General, the AG's office?
Well, according to the sources, if they were aware of the alleged fabrication but still accepted or used that reason in court. Right. They could potentially face accusations of violating constitutional due process. A very serious charge.
And it doesn't stop there, does it?
No. The sources even mention that court officials, like registry staff perhaps, who processed filings containing this allegedly fabricated reason, could potentially be seen as failing in their own duty to ensure administrative justice, assuming they knew or should have known.
Wow. It sounds like the sources are painting a picture of, like, a potential domino effect of responsibility. Shared responsibility across multiple actors in the legal system.
That's certainly the impression given. And they emphasize this isn't just about, individual errors here and there.
Right.
They argue there's a potential collective responsibility for misleading the court, maybe depriving those officers of their fundamental right to due process, and potentially even obstructing the course of justice itself.
Obstructing justice. That's another very serious term.
It is. And to really grasp the sequence of events as the sources lay it out, it might be helpful to just quickly walk through a timeline.
Good idea. Let's map it out.
Okay, so it starts with the initial tribunal hearing.
Step 1.
Then step 2, the oral no jurisdiction ruling is given.
Yep.
Step 3 is what didn't happen. The EPA's failure to lodge an immediate appeal.
The missed opportunity.
Right. Then comes what the sources describe as the crucial turning point. The alleged realization, maybe by the tribunal, that no reason was actually given initially.
The oops moment, potentially.
Which then, according to the sources, leads to step 5, the alleged fabrication of a reason to fill that gap.
The invention of the justification.
Step 6 is this fabricated reason then supposedly being used in later legal proceedings by various parties.
Okay.
And the sources contrast all of this with what they argue should have happened right after step 2, an immediate petition to the High Court for judicial review to compel the tribunal to provide its actual reasoning.
Right, the lawful path versus the alleged fabricated path. This step-by-step really does clarify the chain of events, at least as the sources describe them. And they definitely paint a picture of, well, significant procedural and ethical lapses, to put it mildly.
That's the core assertion, yes.
Now, for you listening, I mean, why should this specific legal tangle grab your attention?
Yeah.
Especially if you're not, navigating the complexities of industrial relations law daily.
Well, I think if we step back and look at the bigger picture here, this situation, as it's described in the sources, it really touches upon some fundamental principles of accountability within our legal system. Full stop.
How so?
It highlights just how crucial it is to follow the established procedures. The rules aren't just suggestions.
What?
It underlines the absolute necessity of transparency in judicial decision-making. Why did they decide that? We need to know. And it points to the very real potential for serious injustice when those processes are, allegedly, undermined or subverted.
So even if the specifics are technical.
Exactly. Even if the details of industrial relations law aren't your everyday concern, the basic idea that a reason for a legal ruling might be, potentially, invented after the fact.
Yeah.
And the kind of domino effect this could have on the entire legal process. That should probably give all of us pause for thought. It makes you reflect on the integrity of the system, right?
Yeah.
The trust we place in it.
Definitely gives you pause. So, okay, let's try and summarize the key takeaways, the main insights we've pulled from this deep dive into the sources.
Okay.
First, there's the EPA's failure to promptly appeal that initial no jurisdiction ruling.
Yeah.
Sources present this as a critical missed step, even calling it a dereliction of duty.
That's point 1, yeah.
Very clear.
Second, the sources strongly assert that creating a reason for a legal ruling after the fact, after the decision is made, is not just improper. It's potentially illegal. It's not the way things should work.
Absolutely central argument.
Third, this alleged fabrication, if it occurred and if it was then used by others, it's described in the sources as potentially being fraudulent collusion.
And that carries potentially huge legal consequences, potentially voiding subsequent actions.
Right. The fraud vitiates everything principle.
Okay, exactly. And finally, the sources suggest that a whole range of parties, not just one actor, could potentially be held legally responsible.
Yeah.
If it turns out a fabricated reason was knowingly used or accepted in legal proceedings down the line.
It's a picture of potentially widespread accountability.
It really is. Which, I guess, leads to a significant question for you, the listener, to maybe ponder. When confidence in core institutions, like the legal system itself, is potentially eroded by events like the ones alleged here, What are the wider implications? What does that mean for justice and fairness across society?
That's a big question, because the sources we've looked at today, they outline this sequence of events with some really significant potential legal ramifications.
Yeah.
It really just underscores, I think, the vital importance of upholding due process, not just in the big, flashy cases, but at every single stage of the legal process, big or small.
Every step matters.
Every step matters. We'd encourage you maybe to think critically about these concepts. We've talked about things like duty, due process, the impact of alleged fraud, and perhaps consider how these fundamental principles might apply in other areas of life, even totally outside the legal world. You might even find it valuable to, I don't know, look up that legal principle we mentioned. Fraud vitiates everything it touches. See how it's been applied.
Interesting idea. Ultimately, this deep dive, for me at least, it highlights the complexity, sure, but also the paramount importance of sticking strictly to proper legal procedures and just ethical conduct within our justice system.
Agree.
It serves as a pretty powerful reminder, I think, that even these seemingly technical legal matters can end up having profound consequences for fairness and accountability, really, for everyone.